Hi everyone, welcome along to the paper 3 Q&A session, our final session of the year. Hopefully you guys that have been to the previous sessions have found them useful. Hope the first exams went well. Right, let's get going. I've got 2 hours to hopefully answer as many questions as possible. Some of it will be theoretical as well, making sure that your theoretical concepts ahead of paper 3 are really, really strong. A couple of things before I start though, just in terms of exam technique generally. So firstly, this paper is very, very time pressured. So those of you that are doing Edexcel, just be aware of the fact that the structure is very different to papers 1 and paper 2. Paper 1 and 2, you'd have had a section A, multiple choice, small questions, and data response would look slightly differently as well. So this paper, you're going to have a 5 marker, an 8 marker, a 12 marker, and then a choice of 2 25 markers, but repeated twice. In other words, you're going to be sitting and writing 2 25 markers, 2 12 markers, 2 8 markers, and 2 5 markers in the 2 hours that you have. So it is extremely time pressured. The other difference between this paper and the other papers, very quickly, is the fact that the 25 marker for this exam, the data is relevant to the 25 marker. Whereas in papers 1 and 2, you had to have your own knowledge. It's obviously not a bad idea to have some knowledge, but actually all of it will be in the data. And the data actually is very, very helpful. They usually provide you a lot of information. All right, so I've had quite a few questions in relation to certain topics on the advanced notice. So let's get started. Those of you that are on YouTube, very quickly before I change slide, this is the webinar for Zoom if you want to join in and ask any questions in the passcode. The other thing really quickly actually is a few of you emailed over about the guidance for paper 3. I'll send a link or write a link on the chat at the end once the video is up on YouTube so that you can access the guidance that I provided for paper 3. All right, let's get started. So our starting point is to deal with a 12 marker or a potential 12 marker in your exam in relation to the labor market. The labor market seems to have a lot of prominence, or it's broken down into all the sections of the labor market are covered. And so I want to make sure that you guys are comfortable answering questions in relation to wage differentials and why wage differentials might exist. I might be wrong, but I do think this lends itself more to an 8 or a 12 than it does to a 25. Could be a 25, but I think it's more probable that it's an 8 or a 12. So let's deal with it as that first. So if I had a question about assess reasons why wage differentials exist in a particular market, the way I would want you to structure this is to talk about the concept of elasticity. And I would potentially do both of my analyses, one after the other, and then evaluate. So let me explain. What I would start off with is describing and explaining a concept known, if I abbreviate it, as WES, which is the wage elasticity of supply for labor. The wage elasticity of supply, in very simple terms, is the percentage change in quantity supplied of labor over the percentage change in the wage, right? In other words, how reactive is the supply of workers, the supply of labor, to a change in the wage rate? And I would always, if I were you, go through 2 extremes. The first extreme is a neurosurgeon, and the other extreme we're going to use is a cashier. So if I said to you, what do you expect the supply of labor to be for a neurosurgeon? Would you expect it to be elastic or inelastic? Obviously very, very inelastic, and there are 2 main reasons why. So if I said to you the wages that neurosurgeons get paid, let's say it went up by 20%, would you expect there to be a dramatic increase in the number of neurosurgeons in the economy? Not really, because 1, there's a massive time lag. It takes ages, it takes years and years and years for someone to train up to become a neurosurgeon. Therefore, that's the first problem. The second thing is that there are very, very, very technical and very difficult skills that need to be acquired. I definitely can't be a neurosurgeon, right? It requires high level of competency, and therefore people need to pass several, very difficult exams. The point then is that the supply of labor for neurosurgeons is very wage inelastic. Comparatively, cashiers, the supply is likely to be far more elastic. And the reason why is because if wages being offered to cashiers were to go up, you'd expect to see a more than proportionate increase in the supply of labor because A, it doesn't take long to train up to be a cashier, and B, the skills required are more limited. It's not very difficult to become a cashier. I mean, we're kind of all cashiers now with self-checkout machines. So that's the first factor that would influence, in my opinion, wage differentials on why obviously neurosurgeons are going to be paid a higher salary than a cashier. The other concept that I would develop this argument through is WED, which is the wage elasticity of demand. Remember that with the labor market, you're looking at it in terms of demand from the perspective of the firm. They're the ones that will demand labor. And the formula is the percentage change in quantity demanded of labor over the percentage change in, again, wage rate, or wages. Okay. again, the two same examples that I went through, but now through the lens of the firms that hire them. Do you expect demand for neurosurgeons to be wage elastic or wage inelastic? Well, obviously inelastic. Why? Because if the wages being paid to neurosurgeons were to go up, there will be a less than proportionate fall in demand for neurosurgeons because they're pretty important. You know, if you're a hospital, you kind of need your neurosurgeons. You can't really have a hospital with zero neurosurgeons. Therefore, demand might fall, but not a dramatic amount. Comparatively, again, if we do cashiers, if the wages paid to cashiers were to go up, there would be a more than proportionate decrease in demand for cashiers. And a big reason why is because they can be more easily substituted for capital machinery. Things like self-checkout machines means that if wages being paid to cashiers continues to rise, hypothetically, there will be a big reduction in the number of units or the number of cashiers that firms would want to hire. Is that pretty clear? That is, I think, 2 paragraphs and very, very, very high level in terms of identifying the 2 things. I would then draw the following. So now that I've gone through this concept, I would draw this. I would go, okay, so imagine this is quantity of labor. And this is the wage rate. On the same diagram, what I would do is I would draw really, really inelastic supply of labor and really, really inelastic demand for labor. Yeah, you know why my thing is gone weird. Oh, there we go, it's working. Yeah, and this is going to be the quantity of neurosurgeons. I'm going to call it QN to represent neurosurgeons, and the wage that the neurosurgeons get paid, WN. On the same diagram, what I would now do, and I make sure that I do it further along because there'll be a higher quantity, so somewhere over there, and obviously start at a lower wage as well. So I make it really elastic. I do like the supply of labor and the demand for labor. And this is the quantity of cashiers that could be hired in the economy and the wages paid to cashiers. Is that clear? Clearly, there's wage differential here, right? Because of the fact that neurosurgeons, so that's an N, by the way. I don't know how obvious that N is, but here we go. It's not hard, not easy to draw on this board. But WN, WC, right? And I would just draw that and explain it in very simple terms. And that should suffice to get you the 8 marks for a question like that about wage differentials. Now we need to go and evaluate. There are 2 evaluations that I think work, but remember, by the way, more so than in papers 1 and paper 2, the data will genuinely help you a lot. A lot of the answer will be derived from the data. So whilst I give you generic points that hopefully, well, should be on the mark scheme and will be on the mark scheme, in truth, you might find something in the data that's more explicit and more obvious that you could use. The first thing that I would talk about is something like the national minimum wage or national living wage can help to reduce income inequality to some extent, because who's more likely to get minimum wage? Is it a cashier or a neurosurgeon? Well, obviously a cashier, right? As a consequence, although yes, there are obviously going to be wage differentials, national minimum wage ensures that firms like Tesco, like Asda, Sainsbury's, there's a limit to how low they can pay their cashiers. And so that wage differential is reduced a little bit. That makes sense? So for example, recently in April, the minimum wage or living wage in the UK was raised to £9.50. Yeah. So yes, okay, it's not going to majorly reduce income inequality, but at the same time, it does a little bit. Is that fair? That's the first. The second evaluation that you could talk about in terms of what might limit wage differentials within within markets is trade union power. Trade unions, their role, and it's very topical right now with the train strikes, but their role is to basically do what we call collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is essentially, because there are loads of people within the union that they represent, they can mobilize them and get them all to go on strike. So therefore, they have more bargaining power when it comes to wages. Well, if they're successful, as potentially they might be with the train strikes, who knows, let's see, they might be able to get higher wages for their workers. So if it is that those who are kind of, or whose wages at the moment are suppressed or are low, it might be the case that trade unions can push up those wages. And so that's the second evaluation. Is that clear? I think that ultimately is how I would answer that as a 12 marker. Hopefully that's pretty apparent and transparent, yeah? Okay. The other things in terms of supply and demand for labor are a bit more straightforward. It might be things like what might cause supply of labor to increase or decrease, or what might cause demand for labor to increase or decrease. I think this is more probable, like in terms of wage differentials, based on what they've provided, but it could easily just be a very simple 8 marker, what's caused wages in an industry to go up or go down. So obviously be familiar with things like, higher levels of immigration, meaning that the supply of labor would shift out. Or actually it might be higher levels of emigration, which is the opposite, where people are leaving, in which case supply would shift in. It might be because of an increase in demand for the goods that are being produced in that industry. So let's say that more and more firms are developing like apps. So as a consequence, there'll be more demand for app developers. right? I think that's what they're called, right? Vice versa, if suddenly there's less demand for particular goods because maybe of the pandemic, the demand for labor would have gone inwards, and things like that. Does that make sense? So you just need to be comfortable with shifts in supply and demand of labor, but that should be pretty straightforward. That shouldn't be complicated. I think the one I've just done is, I hope, the most complicated question they can ask. So hopefully that sheds some light onto that. All right, massive, massive topic that you absolutely need to know inside out is economic development. Economic development will 100% come up, and it's likely to be a high tariff question, a 12, a 25, potentially both, by the way. And I suspect your paper will be broken down between one section on a developing country and then the other section potentially on the UK or like a developed economy, where they'll bring in things, I think, like supply side policies, demand side policies, exchange rates, possibly there. Anyways, we'll deal with that later. In terms of economic development, I thought we'd kind of do two things. One is to revise the concept, but two is to then answer some 25 markers and 12 markers on that topic as well. Yeah, I'll deal with how you do 25 markers in this paper in a second. Firstly, hopefully you guys have pen and paper and that it's not just me talking to myself. Can you try and list as many limitations to growth and development as you can think of, and as many strategies to achieving growth and development as you can think of? I'll give you guys a minute. While I do that, I'm going to drink my Red Bull. But any limitations to growth and development that you can, off the top of your head, remember. It is important that you know quite a few, by the way, because they can ask about a specific one. For example, the June 2018 paper had a specific question about the benefits of aid to Indonesia, giving you one of the strategies to achieve growth already. Yeah. So put together as many as you can think of, and we'll go through them. Right. Before I go through the limitations to growth and development and the strategies, I think it's a good idea to know in a 25 marker in particular how to define economic growth and economic development. So let's have that kind of in your notes. So the starting point is to go, economic growth is a rise in real GDP, very standard definition, just an increase in real GDP. So what's the difference between economic growth and economic development? Well, economic development tries to go beyond just monetary factors. Whereas like if you see economic growth, it's just the total value of all the goods and services produced in an economy in a year, right? Well, economic development also takes into account non-monetary factors such as education, healthcare, and infrastructure. And it's often measured using what we call composite indicators, just a fancy way of saying indicators that are made up of more than one part, such as HDI. Yeah, I would always start with a question about economic development with that definition, because by defining it in that way, you lay out the context, and then every single paragraph, if it's about development, bring it back to HDI. Go, oh, this is going to raise their HDI ranking, etc., etc. Yeah. Okay. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's go through some limitations. Yeah. Limitations. Bear in mind, by the way, it's also known as constraints to economic growth and development. Say same thing. Okay. Number one, the first one that I want to address and make sure you know how to talk about is the Harrod-Domar model, and it's specifically called the savings gap. Right, let's talk about the savings gap and how from the data you could identify that it might exist even if it doesn't explicitly state it. So if I look at a developing economy, an LEDC, would you expect their GDP per capita to be high or low? Well, it's likely to be very low, and the data might even tell you what the GDP per capita is. As a consequence of that, would you expect their marginal propensity to consume to be high or low? Right, quick recap. Marginal propensity to consume is a fancy way of saying, for every additional unit of income you earn, how much of it do you spend? That's marginal propensity to consume. Well, in countries where GDP per capita is really low, the marginal propensity to consume is very, very, very high. And the reason why it's very, very high is because people spend the vast majority of their income on basic necessities like food just to survive. The issue then is that the savings in those economies tend to be very, very low. There's very limited amounts of savings that happen in these countries. That's the first issue. What makes the matter worse is the fact that the banks have little incentive to set up in these countries, because the banks, how do they make their profits? Well, people put money in, their savings, into their account, and then the bank lends it out and make profit on that. Well, if no one is saving in that economy, are banks incentivized to go and set up? Well, not really. So you have limited financial services in that economy as well. The problem then is as follows. A lack of savings translates into banks having insufficient funds, which means they don't lend very much, which translates to low levels of investment in that country. And that is a massive problem because investment doesn't just generate growth through aggregate demand. Higher levels of investment cause LRAS to shift out as well. So if you have limited amounts of savings, that translates into limited amounts of lending, limited amount of investment, low levels of what we call capital accumulation. Capital accumulation is just a fancy way of saying the rate at which the capital stock increases in the economy, and therefore low growth and low economic development. Is that clear? That is the first limitation to growth and development. Nice and hopefully easy. Let's address what we could do to rectify it. Now, sometimes they're directly linked with strategies, sometimes they're not, but this time let's do it linked to it. The evaluation to that is that they might be receiving international aid. And that's actually going to be one of our strategies. So might as well talk about it. Yeah, so we've got strategies. Number one we can do is aid. Not that I'd necessarily do it in this order, by the way, but just so that you're aware of how to do it. Another one is microfinance. So if anyone said microfinance, that's absolutely fine as well. It completely works. But let's talk about aid. If you provide these countries with aid, aid comes in the form of money, but also in the form of like clothing, food, etc. This means that do these individuals need to spend as large a proportion of their income on basic necessities? Well, no, because they have that money or they have the aid providing them with the basic necessities. Therefore, the rate of savings may start to go up. The way they describe this, by the way, is that it may help to fill the savings gap. So if you have a higher level of aid, this means that people can save. The banks therefore start setting up in these countries. They can start lending, and all of the stuff we said that wouldn't happen before can now happen. In the June 2018 paper, paper 3, question 2C has a 12 marker on aid. And like I said, the benefits of aid, that will be one of my benefits. There's a little part on the extract which spoke about them giving, I think, like $14 a month or a week, I can't remember, to people like who are really poor in Indonesia. I'd use that as my reference point to basically say, look, that helps them to save because they can spend that on their necessities, and then whatever they earn, they can save it. Clear? So that's the first benefit of aid. Yeah. The other advantage of aid, by the way, was really explicitly stated in that question, and it was that a lot of the aid was being invested into education and training. And we'll talk about that in more detail later when we discuss our policies, but it's really straightforward. The evaluations, by the way, for aid, very quickly, since we're on there, two things. One is that it might create a dependency culture. Yeah. There is a dependency culture amongst these countries if they rely on the aid. Rather than pursuing sensible supply side policies, they end up relying on aid from foreign, whether it's foreign governments or NGOs and things like that. And so that might actually stall economic growth and development. That's one. Number two, in terms of why aid may not always be the best strategy or why it might not be amazing for them, is because if there's high levels of corruption in that country, the aid might not even go to where it's intended. It might end up in the hands of corrupt officials, which, by the way, is a limitation to growth and development that we'll talk about in a second. The other thing is that the misconception sometimes is that aid isn't always free. It's not always like a gift. It's not like just here's some money and, gone your way. Sometimes the aid has conditions attached, so it's tied aid, or it's a loan, which is presented as aid. So in the last line of that paragraph of the Indonesia question, it spoke about, I think, the Bank of Japan, if I remember correctly, giving a certain amount of money to the Indonesian government, but it explicitly stated lent. They lent money. In other words, the government is going to need to pay this back. There is obviously going to be interest on that loan, and therefore the fiscal deficit, national debt, will be rising. And the consequences of that could be, those of you that partook in the paper 2 Q&A, I spoke a lot about credit ratings and like how if you have a high national debt, it might result in a downgrade in your credit rating because investors are a bit more wary about buying your government bonds. As a result, the demand for your bonds goes down, the price of your bonds goes down, and the interest on your bonds, the yield, goes up. Is that clear? That's the kind of thing that you could talk about. So aid, if it comes up now, you should be so hopefully comfortable answering that like with conviction. Right, back here. 2. Second problem, Harrod-Domar again. The Harrod-Domar model is broken down into 2 parts. This is called the foreign exchange gap. Right, let's chat about the foreign exchange gap. To understand the foreign exchange gap, we actually need to go through a concept which is very important also for exchange rates, which I will do later. It's something called foreign reserves. What are foreign reserves? Foreign reserves are really fancy ways of saying other currency in your economy. So for example, foreign reserves in the UK would be like dollars, yen, euros, real, whatever currency you want to talk about, right? Anything but the pound, basically, yeah? Now, foreign reserves play a pretty important role, but many developing countries have very limited amounts of foreign reserves. If I do a comparison between the currencies of a developing economy and developed countries like the US dollar or the euro. So let's say hypothetically, the extract is about Ghana. Ghana's currency is called I don't know if I'm saying it right, but the CD, yeah? Spelled like this. June 2016, by the way, there's a good question about it. I'll talk about it later. But anyways, the CD, would you expect the CD to be strong or weak relative to like the euro? Obviously quite weak, right? And over time, typically getting weaker. The problem with that then is that if you have insufficient levels of foreign reserves and you live in Ghana, it makes it more and more difficult for you to import because you have to convert more and more of your weak CD to buy €1, to buy $1. And this translates into a deterioration in your terms of trade. By the way, terms of trade, really quickly. So terms of trade is price index of exports, I'll just do it as X, over the price index of imports, right? In very simple terms, your term of trade is a purely monetary concept. It is the value of your exports relative to the value of your imports. If your currency is weak, do you agree that everything that you're selling to the world is now cheaper? So the top of the fraction is going down. And everything you're buying from the world is now more expensive because your currency is weak. So the imports are becoming more expensive. This mathematically, some of you might be saying, oh, it balances out. No, it doesn't. The top of the fraction going down causes the overall number to go down. And the bottom of the fraction, the denominator, getting bigger causes the overall number to go down even more. So they're both acting to push down your terms of trade. The terms of trade are bad, you're getting affected here, yeah? And this is the problem for countries because if you don't have much foreign reserves, you're going to struggle to import. That in itself limits or reduces living standards. But a really important thing is the fact that they can't or find it difficult to import the capital machinery that they need to develop sectors like manufacturing. That's the first problem. Second problem of having insufficient levels of foreign reserves is most debt, international debt to institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, is quoted in which currency? Well, obviously it's quoted in US dollars. Therefore, again, if you have insufficient levels of foreign reserves, you have insufficient levels of like dollars in your economy, you're going to struggle to pay off these debts, to service these debts, because over time, you're going to have to convert more and more of your weak currency to buy $1 in the Forex. This makes it harder for these countries to service their debts. And again, then is a big limitation to growth and development. Hopefully that's pretty clear, yeah? All right, so that's our second limitation to growth and development in terms of as a concept. Just rub this out. Let's evaluate that, because again, the evaluation of this is a strategy, and I would not be surprised if your extract is all about this, or at least one part of the extract is all about this. What could the government do to try and fill the foreign exchange gap? How do you get more foreign reserves into your economy? Well, number two is you develop tourism. You develop the tourism sector. That's what you do. And the reason why you develop tourism is because tourists, international tourists, need to convert their international currency to buy goods and services in your economy, fine? Therefore, they're going to now bring a higher stock of foreign reserves into your country, yeah? Now, some of you might be saying things like, oh, well, when I went to like, I don't know, Spain, I did my exchange here in the UK. How come? So how does this work? That's because Spain don't have a lack of foreign reserves. If you try to basically look for developing economies, so I went to a couple of years ago to Tanzania, I looked everywhere for Tanzanian shillings in London. Like even at the airport at Heathrow, I just would not find anywhere that exchanged Tanzanian shillings. And there's a reason why, because it's really difficult for you to actually find it anywhere outside of their economy. So when I landed, as soon as I landed, there's a massive queue of all these like people from all over the world that are converting their currency into the Tanzanian shilling. The stock of foreign reserves therefore rises when you've got a strong tourism sector. Let's say the 12 marker this year is on tourism. Let's deal with tourism and how we'll be able to answer that easily. Number one, the first thing that I would talk about for tourism wouldn't actually be the foreign exchange gap. That'll be number two. The first thing I would talk about for tourism and why it's going to help that economy is that it's likely to attract foreign direct investment, obviously, right? In particular, what type of TNCs would want to set up in a country that has a high number of visitors to that particular area? Obviously hotels, right? So if you're a hotel like, I don't know, let's say the Hilton, you realistically will set up in a country that has a strong tourism sector. And then all the benefits of FDI, there's so many that you could talk about. One, first benefit of FDI is the fact that it's going to create jobs in the economy. Two, we did a little quick chain of reasoning here. So we go, all right, investment is a component of, hopefully you guys are shouting out AD. So AD is going to shift outwards. Investment is also an injection into the circular flow of income. And so there will be a positive multiplier effect. Now, little bonus point for you if you want a bonus point. Let's say this is a 25 marker and this was my macro point. So I'll be talking about how it's it's an injection circular flow of income. So there's gonna be a multiplier effect. In LEDCs, would you expect the multiplier to be big or small? To remind you guys, and those of you that sat paper 2 the other day, this was your first question, fun times, would have been, the formula for the multiplier is 1 over 1 minus MPC, right? The bigger this number, the bigger the MPC, the bigger the multiplier. And what did I say would be the MPC in developing economies? It's going to be really big. They spend the vast majority of the money they earn on basic necessities. Therefore, the multiplier is enormous in a developing economy. So that's a little bonus point if you wanted to add that into your development for like a 25 marker, yeah? So you can go, oh, the multiplier is going to be really big because their marginal propensity to consume is likely to be high. You would then draw the diagram with aggregate demand shifting out, do it twice, why not, just to show off. The first shift is because of investment rising, the second shift because of the multiplier, yeah? And then you summarize the diagram, talk about economic growth and all of that. Now, one of the skills that we will really address in this Q&A is the ability to bring in micro concepts as well, or how to take a macro concept and make it a micro point. There's a really clever point that I could do about why FDI is really beneficial. Because if TNC is set up in your country, it is often in their interest to improve the infrastructure of that economy. So if I'm a hotel chain, do you agree that I need to make sure the roads are manageable enough that people can get from the airport to my hotel, right? So I have an interest, I have a vested interest as a hotel to improve the roads, the infrastructure. So I'll build like new roads, yeah? But does that only benefit me? No, it will benefit the wider society, all the companies that will use that road, all the different firms that are using that road. What is that an example of? Because this is an exceptional point. I think that if I were you, I would be talking about this. Some of you are saying positive externality. It's not true, by the way. I understand why you're saying that, but an externality is a bad thing. It means not enough of something's being done. The correct answer, and some of you have got it, is that this is external economies of scale. External economies of scale is essentially where the average cost for multiple firms in an industry are falling. All of the firms that now have access to that road suddenly find their average cost going down. And the reason why is because their vehicles, let's say they use lorries to transport whatever goods from one area to another, are breaking down less often because the roads are a lot better. It's going to take a lot less time for them to get from A to B because the roads are a lot better, right? There's less likely to be accidents on that road, etc. The point then is on a micro level, FDI caused by tourism or any FDI is likely to result in external economies of scale, where the long run average costs for multiple firms in that country will fall. And if their costs are falling, what's happening to their profits? Their profits are going up. What could they do with the profits? Invest it into R&D or whatever good stuff they want to invest it into. Therefore, they become more dynamically efficient. Easy? That is the kind of thing that you're going to do in the 25 marker. And we'll do this multiple times today so that you understand that actually this paper is not that challenging. It's okay. There's one rule that I will talk about later in terms of micro, how to know that you've nailed the micro analysis. But anyways, right. So that's the first analysis for tourism. The evaluation for tourism, very topical, is that tourism is very vulnerable to like external shocks. The best example by miles, and if they do test this, I'll be astonished if this isn't in the data, if it was about tourism, is COVID. You know, like that was really bad for tourism. It would have resulted in such a significant fall in the GDP for countries that are reliant on tourism. Countries that generate a huge amount of tax revenue from tourism were really badly hit by this, yeah? So that could be like a really good evaluation for that. The second analysis is to talk about how the tourism is going to help to fill the foreign exchange gap, because we said that's a limitation to growth and development. It's going to allow these countries, their terms of trade are going to improve. It makes it easier for them to import capital machinery so they could start developing sectors like the manufacturing sector. Yes, stuff like that. The evaluation to that. So again, let's say I wanted to do a micro evaluation. Very easy. And hopefully you guys are very comfortable with this from paper 1 now. Tourism tends to result in way more pollution in your country because more people are coming onto planes and coming into your country. The TNCs themselves are importing loads of like capital and food and whatever into the country. All of this translates into higher negative externalities. Easy peasy. That's your evaluation. You go, however, it may result in market failure in that country. You then talk about the fact that there's going to be way more pollution. You then draw the negative externality diagram, explain the diagram. The examiner's crying at this point at how good your answer is. easy peasy. Yeah, 12 out of 12 comfortably, 25 out of 25 versus 25 marker. Clear? These are some of the things that we could talk about in terms of tourism. Cool? Right, back this way. So if my board will allow me to go back. Yes, it will allow me. Number 3 is absolutely massive. Number 3 has been asked as a 12 marker in June 2017. It has been asked as a 12 marker in the old spec in June 2016. It got asked as a 12 marker in June 2013. It gets asked a lot, basically. My point is that you really need to know this. Number 3 is primary product dependency. Right. I hope I'm spelling dependency wrong. All right. Might be an E, who knows. Right. Let me just address a few things about prime product dependency and how you would answer questions about it and the theory underpinning it. Plus, since I published the guidance for paper 3, apologies, by the way, there's a technical issue with the website, which meant that we couldn't upload it on the website, but it's on our social media. And I will, like I said, I will post it on the YouTube video of this as soon as it's finished, as soon as it's uploaded, as a little comment at the bottom. But anyways, on there, I came up with a question that's not on the pack that I've recently thought of that I think I want to make sure you know how to answer as a 5 marker. Because I was trying to piece together, they had like elasticity on there. And it was a bit random. It was like, why is elasticity on there? Perhaps it's combined with another topic. And I think it could be combined with this as a 5, but let me explain how. First and foremost, what are primary products? Primary products are anything that is sourced from the earth. So natural resources. Examples would be like soft commodities. So wheat, cocoa, barley, I don't know, stuff like that. And there are hard commodities as well. So like copper, zinc, gold, aluminium, etc. Yeah. If it is a hard commodity this year, my prediction is that it will be about Zambia, who specialize in copper, because they did Chile in 2017 for copper. So anyways, not important which country it is. Let's talk about primary product dependency. The first problem with primary product dependency is that the prices of primary products tend to be extremely volatile. They go up and down really, really like dramatically. And this is my predicted 5-mark question, or potential. Let's not call it a predicted question. That's a really bad word. So let's say the question said this. Using the concept of PED, explain why primary products tend to be extremely volatile in price. Let's go through it. This is what I would do in terms of laying it out to get all of these marks. The starting point is I would define PED. And bear in mind, in the exam, you just need to do the formula. You don't need to do the worded definition. It's great if you know the worded definition, but it's a waste of time doing it in the exam. It's time pressured. You simply write PED equals percentage change in quantity demanded over percentage change in price. And you literally abbreviate it like I've drawn it here, yeah? So that's the first thing I would do. Second thing is, now, especially if we're dealing with like food, but also like hard commodities, but like especially things like cocoa, rice, sugar, blah, 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 would you expect the demand for commodities to be elastic or inelastic? The answer is blatantly inelastic. And the reason why is because they are necessities. We kind of need food to live. So you go, the PED for whatever item it is that's quoted in the extract is likely to be price inelastic. You can show off by saying that the PED will be less than 1. Yeah. And explain briefly why, because it's a necessity. Yeah. That's the first part of the answer. Obviously, there'll be data reference as well. Yeah. What I would now say is that they are also really vulnerable to external supply side shocks like weather. So the weather has a major impact on how much can be produced of that commodity in a given year, right? I would now draw this. And I would like you to also draw this, by the way, in the exam. So you just draw P and Q. To really emphasize this point, I'm going to make sure my demand curve is really inelastic, like this. Yeah? And then I just want a standard upward sloping supply curve as such. S1, and label the initial equilibrium Q1, P1. Yeah? Now, what I would now explain is, and it might be in the extract, is let's say there was a drought, or let's say there was flooding, or whatever adverse weather that causes supply to shift inwards. The consequences of that, so let's have supply shifting in quite a bit, is S2. Right. Look at how much my price goes up on this diagram comparative to what happens to my demand. Well, what happens is the price goes up dramatically for this commodity, but there is a less than proportionate fall in demand because this particular good is a necessity. And the reality is that people will be willing to pay a substantially higher price than before to get it. And thus, because the product is now more scarce, the supply curve shifting in results in a massive increase in the price, but a teeny tiny decrease in demand. The amount of units that are consumed doesn't dramatically fall. All of the units that the farmers produce will be consumed, and the price they can charge will be way higher. Hence why prices in these markets, they don't just go up and down a little bit, they do like this. They like crazily up and crazily down, right? That would be the 5 marker, if I'm completely wrong, right? But that would be how you answer a question like that. Is that clear? So you basically lay it out as PED is this. It's likely to be inelastic. This is vulnerable to supply side shocks, like bad weather. A supply side shock causing supply to shift inwards leads to a massive increase in price, but a less than proportionate fall in demand for this commodity. Hence why it's so volatile. So far, so good? Hope that's clear. Okay, then in terms of why it is problematic to be primary product dependent, well, there are 2 key reasons. There are 3, but 2 I think that are pretty good. I'll do all 3 in a second, but number 1 is that the volatility of these markets makes it extremely difficult to invest. It deters both FDI, but also domestic investment. Because if a market has like prices doing that the whole time, you don't have any degree of certainty. The level of investment, therefore, in these economies tends to be very, very low because it's too risky. And I would describe this, I would be talking about how prices are really volatile. If they are reliant on selling this commodity as the main source of export earnings, well, think about what happens when the price goes down. When the price of this item goes down, demand does go up, but is it going to go up a lot or a little? Well, we said demand is inelastic, so therefore, a massive reduction in the price would lead to a less than proportionate increase in demand, true? As a result, are they making more or less money? They're making substantially less revenue. Their export earnings are therefore going to go really badly down when prices go down. Export earnings means that their current account is going to get worse. X minus M is a component of AD. AD will shift inwards and all of that fun stuff, right? And you could talk about all of that. Is that clear? That makes it a really easy analysis to develop through that chain. That's the first. The second problem is through a concept or a theory called Prebisch-Singer. In a nutshell, this is what the Prebisch-Singer hypothesis says about primary product dependency. It says, if you're a country that's relying on exporting primary products, over time that will enable you to buy less and less from the global market. And the rationale behind it is if we compare the YEDs for manufactured goods to commodities, particularly food, the YED for manufactured goods tends to be far more elastic. To remind you guys about what YED is how reactive your demand is following a change in your income. So let's assume that both of these goods are normal, both manufactured goods are normal goods and primary products are normal goods, right? And let's see what happens. Because as global incomes go up, the demand for manufactured goods is going to go up at a much faster rate than the demand for primary products, especially things like food. The example I always give is, imagine my income doubled tomorrow. Am I going to double the amount of food that I eat? Am I going to go crazy and start like ordering double everything? I should go like Nando's and just order 2 burgers and 2 chips. And obviously not, right? I might like switch to like higher quality food. I might eat a little bit more, but I'm not going to go mental, right? Therefore, the YED, especially for food, is very, very inelastic. Now, just for illustrative purposes, let me show you what that means. If I have something like this, price, quantity, price, quantity. Okay, let's assume that we are dealing with the following countries. So let's say this is the Ivory Coast. Okay, and Ivory Coast, their speciality, by the way, is cocoa. So this is the price they're charging for their cocoa. Let's say this is Germany. And Germany, as you of course know, are strong in the manufacturing sector, yeah? Okay, just to make our life a little bit easier, I'm going to manipulate the diagram a little bit. This one, right, this is very, very rough. Just for this. You'll never need to draw this, by the way, just to be clear. This is me just explaining the concept to you, okay? Right, so hypothetically, let's assume that initially the price of the primary product that Ivory Coast charge is this P1, and the price that Germany is charging for their good is P1 here. If Ivory Coast were to sell 1 unit to the global market, how many units could they therefore buy? In other words, how much could they import from Germany? Promise it's not a trick question. I like trick questions, but not here. It's obviously 1, right? Because they're the same price. Now, what happens is global incomes pretty much always go up. There's very few occasions in history where they go down. So, for example, the Great Depression, 1930, 2008 financial crash, but rarely, more often than not, global incomes are rising. And if you think about what we just said a second ago, the demand for primary products will go up for like food, but will there be a dramatic increase in demand? Well, the answer is no, not really, because it's pretty inelastic. So what will happen is demand does go up a little bit, like here. So good for Ivory Coast, because look, they get a higher price, right? The problem, though, is that the demand for manufactured goods is far more elastic. So, for example, if I have a 20% increase in my income and I get another laptop, That'll be the second laptop I have. I have one. That's a 100% increase in the number of laptops that I have. The demand is dramatically rising here. Hence, demand does something like this. It doesn't just go up a little bit, it majorly increases. And the consequences of that is now my question again. If the Ivory Coast sell 1 unit to the market in the global market, can they still buy 1 unit from Germany? The answer is obviously no, because their price now is substantially lower relative to the German price. Hence, their terms of trade are deteriorating. And if your terms of trade are deteriorating due to your over-reliance on a primary product, the consequences of that is that you find it more difficult to import goods, living standards go down. 2, you find it more difficult to import the capital machinery that you need to develop, ironically, the very sector that Germany thrives on, which is manufacturing. You become even more primary product dependent. Is that clear? That's why purchasing is a pretty powerful theory to bring in. Is that clear? Right, in terms of the evaluations, really quickly, and then we'll do some 25 markers, because I know loads of you are asking questions, and I promise I will get there. As an evaluation, I think there are 2 really clever evaluations for this. The first is in terms of the volatility and difficulty in planning ahead. Well, farmers or producers can utilize something called forward markets. Yeah. If you remember from your revision, hopefully for paper 2, in the financial sector, one of the things that you could use is forward markets. A forward market is basically where you agree in advance to sell your commodity for a fixed price, and you are guaranteed that price later down the line at that set date, irrespective of what the actual market price is of that commodity at that time. So if the price of the commodity has completely plummeted by that point, it doesn't matter. You guaranteed your price, you're going to get your price. If it goes up, yeah, you just get the price that you basically agreed on. You don't get the higher price, but still, that gives you a higher degree of clarity. You can plan around that price. You can go, oh, okay, well, you know, I'm going to basically make sure that I invest X amount because I know I'm going to get this amount of money. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's the first evaluation. Second evaluation for primary product dependency generally is that realistically, that country is likely to have a comparative advantage in the production of that commodity. More often than not, the reason why is because they just have a natural climate to grow that thing. So like the Ivory Coast, there's a reason why they grow so much cocoa, because they have the right weather to grow the cocoa. As a consequence, economic theory would argue they should specialize, because by tapping into their comparative advantage, specializing, and then trading, it leads to a more efficient allocation of their resources and therefore higher living standards. Okay. The other, by the way, generic evaluation is that in times when there's a commodity boom, so when the price is really, really high and their revenue is higher and they're generating more profit and the government tax revenue is high, that might have been the opportunity for the government to diversify. The government could have collected the tax revenue at that point and started investing into capital machinery to develop the manufacturing sector or to develop the services sector or, I don't know, tourism, right? So in other words, when there is a boom, maybe they could use that opportunity to now grow and develop other sectors so that they're less primary product dependent. Is that clear? These are the key evaluations that I think you need to address. All right, let's start talking in terms of the 25 marker. Hopefully that's a little bit of a refresher in terms of the key things to do. There are other limitations and there are other strategies. I will hop around a little bit so that I don't spend the whole session just giving you guys theory, because I know that can get really boring. In terms of questions that I want to basically go through, yeah? I think that I just want to have a quick conversation about this 25 marker and what you do. The only question where you need to do micro and macro, for those of you that do Edexcel, is just the 25 marker. I never want you to do micro and macro unless like you're really stuck and you just think of a macro point in a micro essay in the 5, 8, or 12. Those, you just answer them as if it's like a paper 1 or paper 2 exam. Forget mixing the two together. The only time you do it is in the 25 marker, and I would always separate it. I would have one detailed analysis on micro, and then I would evaluate. The evaluation could be, by the way, macro or micro, doesn't make a difference. And then the second analysis, all macro. And again, evaluation could be either, it doesn't make a difference. And obviously do a judgment. When it comes to micro, the absolute holy grail, if you get to this point, you know you're smashing it, is that you want to bring it to the firm and to profitability on a cost and revenue diagram. And every single question that we will do together, I will show you how you can link it to cost and revenue to make your life easier. Let's do it. The first 25 marker that I want us to do is as follows. Evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of supply side policies in whatever country. I have no idea which country they're going to basically give it to, but that. So let's do it. What I'd like you to do, just so that you think, and it's not just me like talking continuously, and also because I need to drink my Red Bull, can you please bullet point as many supply side policies as you can think of? And what I want to do is a little exercise to show you, because this is obviously a macro concept, right? I want to show you how easy it is to convert the majority of these into a micro point easily, like so easy. So create a list of as many supply side policies as you think of, and then let's deal with it together. Right. Okay. Someone's asked about whether they would ask for market-based or intervention. So it's a very good question. They could. I suspect not, to be honest, based on like trends in the past. They're more likely to just open it and say supply side policies generally. But while I go through them, I will discuss what the difference is between market-based and interventionist in case it is one and not both. But it's a really good question. Okay, ready? Let's create a list. There are so many supply side policies. I think we want to do about 4 or 5 at least that we're comfortable basically developing. Yeah. Number one, first supply side policy is investment into education and training. What you're doing right now. Investment into education and training is one of, if not the easiest one, that you should be comfortable developing. And we'll talk about it in a lot of depth. Yeah. 1. 2. A second supply side policy is a reduction in what we call red tape measures, which is a kind of colloquial way of saying deregulation. Yeah. So if you said deregulation, then absolutely fine. So reduction in red tape. Yeah. So basically things like removing national minimum wage, reducing employment laws, in other words, making it easier for firms to hire and fire their workers, allowing them to have more 0-hour contracts, stuff like that. So we'll deal with that in a sec. Number 3, another supply side policy, really easy, is reduction in corporation tax. Reduction in corporation tax. Basically, if you reduce corporation tax, firms have more profits left over. This means they can invest into new technology, blah, blah, blah. We'll deal with that as well. Lastly, number 4, the last one is, well, there's more than 4, sorry, but like the last one I want to go through is a very easy one, subsidies. Now, do you agree that of these 4, one is pretty obviously micro because you know it from theme 1. So that's the one I would definitely do on a micro level, by the way. But even then, I want to illustrate to you how you go beyond the basics of theme 1. You guys are better than theme 1. You're better than just a standard supply and demand diagram, especially in 25. If it was an 8, if it was a 12, if it was a 5, no problem. 25 markers, I forbid you to draw supply and demand unless you are dying in this exam, like absolutely dying. This is what we're going to do. And by the way, we'll go through the others in terms of how to convert these into micro comfortably. But starting with subsidies, I would start off with the following topic sentence, by the way, and I would make it clear what the topic sentence, like what I'm doing, whether it's micro or macro. So I would say something like this. I would say, one microeconomic effect of supply side policies is to increase profitability for firms. That's my topic sentence. Yeah. I would then introduce which supply side policy it is that I'm dealing with. So I would say, in this example, the government could subsidize whatever industry that they're talking about in the extract. Yeah. All right. Do you remember how I said earlier, whenever you can, and you should be able to in almost all questions, bring it back to cost and revenue. You start off by defining what a subsidy is. A subsidy is a grant given by the government to producers, which decreases their costs of production, resulting in lower prices and higher output. No, we should all know that definition quite comfortably. How is that linked to cost and revenue? Because your instinct is to draw a supply and demand diagram with supply shifting out, right? Well, the key part of my definition was that it decreases the cost for firms. Do you know how to draw a diagram where costs decrease? Of course you do. The other question is, what type of cost is it? Is it variable or fixed? It is variable. The reason why it's variable is because they subsidize each unit that is produced. Let's draw it. The diagram is going to look like this. If you are not amazing at drawing cost and revenue diagrams, not to overly plug myself, but you really need to watch my video on YouTube, which goes through systematically how to draw step-by-step cost and revenue diagrams. So the very first thing that I want to do is I want to draw the MC curve. Just do it. It's MC. I will then draw AR and MR. So this is AR equals D. This is MR. Go to the profit maximizing level of output where MC equals MR to get the quantity the firm is producing Q1. Go up till you hit the demand curve to get the price P1. And then I would always make them make supernormal profit to start off with. You don't have to, you can make them make normal profit, I don't mind. But I think it just is easier to show it like that. So we've got something like that. AC, go up from Q1 to the AC curve, and here is my cost C1. Now, because this is going to shift, you should always label the corners of the area in letters. So A, B. So my initial supernormal profit area on this diagram, as you can see hopefully, is P1, A, B, C1. Cool? Now, what did I just say? I just said that the subsidy decreases the variable cost for the firm. What shifts? Well, what shifts is both MC and AC. If it was a fixed cost, only AC would have shifted down. But this is a variable cost. So that translates to the following. I shift MC always first. Never ever shift AC first when both of them are shifting. So I'm going to shift it. And the way to think of it in micro, by the way, in terms of like cost and revenue, rather than inwards and outwards, that's confusing, up or down. Are marginal costs going to go up or are they going to go down? Well, the answer is they're going to go down, right? So I shift it down, making sure that it does not intersect the old MC curve at any level of output, that it's lower at every quantity compared to the old MC curve. They're not allowed to intersect. If they did, that is wrong. You're not allowed to do that. Right, before I shift the AC curve though, to remind you what do we do now? We get the new quantity and the new price. So you go, here's the new quantity, Q2, and I go up until I hit the demand curve. So the price, as we would expect, because it's a subsidy, has gone down to P2. And then the last thing I now do is now I shift the AC down, making sure that it hits the new MC curve at its lowest point. So I'm going to pick a point like over here. I'm going to go out like that. And that's AC2. Finally, what I do is I go up from the new quantity. The most important point on the diagram now is Q2. Go up from Q2 to hit the AC curve, which hits it there. That is the new cost, C2. And finally, D and E. Yeah? Cool. We now have so much to say compared to a standard supply and demand subsidy diagram. Once you've drawn this, firstly, this is a really, really high level diagram. But once you've drawn it, and I know there's a lot going on here, you say the following, you go, the subsidy causes the price that whoever these firms charge to decrease from P1 to P2. As a result, their sales rise from Q1 to Q2, yeah? What happens to costs? Costs decrease from C1 to C2. And profits, by the way, will go up from P1 ABC1 to P2 DEC2, fine? Now, there is a bonus if you wanted to. You don't have to. So if this isn't 100% clear, close your ears, I don't mind. But, you know, sometimes when I look at this diagram, people are like, I'm a bit confused because prices went down and your cost, yeah, your cost went down and my one a lot. But what if the cost had gone down by the same amount? How do you know whether you made more money or less money? How more profit or less profit? The answer is kind of technical. So you can actually explain this in a 25 mark and it will be very impressive if you do. But at the profit maximizing level of output, Q1 over here, at that initial quantity there, where the demand curve is hit at A, is demand elastic or inelastic? How you know? From theme 3, really quickly, is this. This is a demand curve, AR equals D, and marginal revenue is half of its slope. The point at which marginal revenue hits the demand curve is 100% the midpoint. And at that level, it is unit elastic. Therefore, above that price, it's elastic. In other words, at profit maximizing, and all the bottom bit by the way will be inelastic, but at the profit maximizing level of output over here, this, and by the way, all of the profit maximizing level, because it will always be to the left of MR equals 0. MR equals 0 is there, right? We're always going to be somewhere over there. The firm is operating at the elastic section of the demand curve. Therefore, think about what we know from theme 1. A decrease in the price, even if it doesn't look like it on my diagram, it definitely doesn't look like it on my diagram, but a decrease in the price would result in a more than proportionate increase in demand for this firm's goods. Therefore, their revenue 100% is going up. Theoretically, whenever a firm reduces its price, when they're operating at the profit maximizing level of output, demand will go up more than how much the price went down by, and revenue therefore goes up. Well, if revenue is going up and costs are going down, you're definitely making more profit. Anyways, back to, so you can unplug your ears if that was like confusing. But now we go, okay, so the higher profits, what could they do with the profits? The firm can invest the profits into new technology. They're going to become more dynamically efficient. Happy, happy, happy days. Yeah. If you had so much time, I doubt you will. If you had a lot of time, you could even go and flesh this out in more detail by saying, oh, by innovating and investing, this firm becomes more globally competitive. And therefore they can increase there might be more demand for their goods in the kind of in the global market. But I think that's a bit enough. Like, as in, we can calm down there. If you have time, I don't know, like you came back at the end of the exam and you're like, oh, no, what, 10 minutes left. Then you can chuck in stuff like that as well. Right, let's evaluate. There are two evaluations. There is a standard evaluation that you could do for subsidies all the time. And then there is an evaluation that I think is absolutely jaw-droppingly good. And I have to shout out one of my students. I have to tell him that he got this when I asked him earlier today. Well done to Jay for this. In the chat, you can message me directly, or you can just write it, shout at your screen. There are two evaluations. One is really good, by the way. It's on the mark scheme all the time, and we can develop it easily. But there's one that is just wow, like incredible, like amazingly good. Right. The one that's definitely going to be all the time on the mark scheme and is really straightforward is dependency culture. That it might basically result in these firms becoming overly reliant and dependent on the government to subsidize them. And therefore, rather than efficiency increasing, they might become inefficient. They might become really complacent and lazy, right? That's a problem. The wow evaluation, the evaluation that's like, oh, okay, then you went there, is, do you guys agree that subsidies is an example of protectionism? Because under protectionism, you're giving an unfair advantage to your domestic firms. What might governments in other countries therefore do? They might retaliate and there might be a trade war. And if there's a trade war and they start putting up tariffs on you, then actually, although your costs go down and you make more sales in your domestic economy, you might find that your profits don't go up, they might go down because you struggle to sell your good in the foreign market. You struggle to sell your goods globally because if everyone suddenly reacted to the government subsidizing you by imposing tariffs on you, you suddenly see an inward shift of AR and MR. And I would draw that in the evaluation, by the way. I'm not going to draw it now. In the evaluation is to say, however, whether their profits goes up depends on what other countries do, because this is a form of protectionism. If other countries retaliate by imposing tariffs, the demand for your product may fall, AR and MR, in they go, and then actually it might result in profits going down rather than up, yeah? So one of you was asking about how is that protectionism? Well, protectionism, by the way, there are three types. Tariffs, which is a tax on imports. 2, quotas, which is an upper limit on the number of units you allow into your country. 3, domestic subsidies. Because if a government subsidizes its firms, it gives them an unfair advantage in the global market because their products are suddenly cheaper. But they shouldn't be cheaper. They're only cheaper because the government is subsidizing them. So they look price competitive. Countries therefore might retaliate. The specimen paper, the lock specimen for paper 2, was about a trade war between the EU and China, and specifically because the Chinese government were being accused of subsidizing the mobile telecommunications industry. So the EU were like, no, we're going to impose a tariff, right? This then is a potential evaluation. Is that clear? So you basically go, oh, actually, their profits might not necessarily go down, yeah? So if they retaliate these countries and impose protectionism or like tariffs on your country, the demand for your firm suddenly goes down. And you can draw AR and MR shifting in. You could talk about how actually it depends on what proportion of their sales are domestic compared to international. And you could talk about something else. If AR and MR are shifting in, then what would happen? The consequences of what might happen is I introduce you to my friend Skepta. I actually genuinely don't know. I have one song. And the one song that I know of his is Shut Down. The firm might shut down. You can even show off and go, oh, it might be the AR curve shifts so much that it falls below average variable cost. Oh, my days. And therefore, they shut it down. That is a stupendous evaluation, if I may say so. It is so different to what everyone else will be talking about, but it's so good. That is your micro. Is that clear? Let's go back and deal with a few of the others. Now, if I was doing macro, by the way, very easy. I would 100% choose this as my macro point, the supply side policy. Investment into education and training. There are a multitude of different points that you can make. One is that it's going to result in workers becoming more efficient and productive. 2, it decreases a concept known as unit labor cost. Unit labor cost is a fancy way of saying the cost per worker relative to the output the worker produces. In other words, imagine hypothetically, I hire one worker and I pay them £10 and they make 10 units. I then hire a second worker who I pay £1,000, but that worker produces 1 million units. Who has a lower unit labor cost, the first or the second? The second, yes, I pay them £1,000, but they produce 1 million units. So the average cost, the cost per unit is way lower. And if you invest into education and training, your workers become more skilled, they can produce way more output, right? This could result in two things. One is that you might become more globally competitive. You could see an increase in demand for your goods because you're cheaper, because you're more price competitive, and because of the fact that quality might rise because you're more likely to have like innovations in your economy if the workforce is smart. The other thing that you could talk about is that it could rectify or reduce structural unemployment in the economy. Structural, to remind you, is basically where like certain skills in an economy are outdated, and so you help them address that by giving them skills that are relevant to the economy. LRIS shifts out, the productive capacity of the economy increases. You could, if you had time, talk about how highly educated workforce is going to attract FDI, blah, blah, blah. You get the point. It's easy peasy. Is that clear? Then the evaluation to that particular point is really straightforward. There are two. One is that there's a massive time lag. Yeah. There's such a huge time lag between investing into education and training schemes and it impacting the economies. That's one. Number two, if you had time lag is definitely going to be there. If you had time, is this cheap? Of course not, right? It's going to spend a lot of money on this, right? Therefore, if the government is spending large amounts of money on it, we know what our chain of reasoning is, hopefully now, higher fiscal deficit, higher national debt. As soon as you have higher national debt, you go, credit rating. Credit rating might get downgraded. If you're not 100% about that chain of reasoning, I know paper 2 is finished, but watch the Q&A from last week. It's all a blur. Last week, and I talked about that a lot. Credit rating downgrade, demand for bonds down, price of bonds down, yield up, problemo. Because it's harder for the government to service future debts because their cost of borrowing is now higher. Clear? Hopefully that's easy. Those are the two. Now, I did promise that I would at least do one more of these to show you how I would do it from a micro perspective. Number 2, reduction in red tape measures. If you make it easier for firms to hire and fire workers, if you eliminate or reduce things like minimum wage, and if you relax environmental laws for firms, what is happening to their costs? Their costs are obviously going down. What did I say? I want the micro point to always go back to cost and revenue diagram. Do you know what diagram is relevant? Literally that again. It's exactly the same diagram. The variable cost for the firm will decrease if there are less like restrictions on them hiring and firing their workers, if it's easier for them to kind of produce output, blah, blah, blah. The difference here, though, with the evaluation for this is, do you know what I would evaluate for reduction in red tape measures? I would evaluate on a micro level that it's likely to result in more externalities and draw a negative externality. Because I would talk about how if you relax things like environmental laws, firms could get away with polluting through their nose, higher levels of external costs, market failure, blah, blah, blah. Okay. One of the questions here is occupational immobility the same as structural unemployment? Sort of. Yeah, I guess so. Because if there's occupational immobility, people are struggling to move from one sector to another to take up a job. So yeah, I guess it is very similar to structural unemployment. I'd separate the two, but yeah. Right. Hopefully that answers supply side policies. And if you get that, you're basically laughing. I want to go through. So evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic factors that influence how a business grows. Okay. I mean, that could be asked. I mean, let's not rule anything out because I might look stupid on Monday, but okay, let's deal with that. So the microeconomic and macroeconomic factors that influence how a business grows. This, by the way, is a micro topic, right? Because of the fact that business growth is within the micro specification. Easy peasy analysis when it comes to the micro side. So we start, by the way, I'd always start with the segment that you feel more comfortable doing, that you can develop in more detail, that gets you into the higher level, into level 4 immediately and sets like a really good impression in the examiner's mind. Number 1, the easiest factor that will influence business growth is basically it's non-organic, if you like. Mergers. They can merge, right? Just do that as a whole paragraph. You go, oh, one way in which a firm could grow, or one microeconomic factor that could influence a firm's growth is their ability to merge, or if they merge with another company in their industry. That is, as you know, horizontal integration. And there are several things that I can talk about in terms of why horizontal integration is really beneficial. First is that the merged firm, again, I've done this quite extensively in for the paper 1 Q&A, but merged firms are better placed to tap into their economies of scale, right? I would always define it. I would say this is where long run average costs are falling as output rises. 2 is I would always give an example. To give it more depth, the example you should always do is purchasing economies of scale. So easy. Every single firm needs to bulk buy some raw materials. So let's say it was 2 car companies that are merging. Well, the consequences of that is that they could bulk buy more, I don't know, steel, rubber, tires, stuff, engines. Yeah, give examples of that. And again, the data might be useful in that regard. And then you could talk about how by tapping into these economies of scale, it enables the firm to reduce its average cost and operate closer to its MES. So MES is basically the bottom of the AC curve. It's just a really fancy way of describing that. So that's the minimum efficient scale. It's the minimum amount of output that's required for a firm to be at the bottom of its AC curve, and therefore they'd be productively efficient. Yeah, this translates into them being able to charge lower prices to consumers and gain more market share because customers are more likely to buy their car compared to like another company's car whose prices are much higher because they can't tap into the same economies of scale as the merged firm. Is that clear? That's one. The evaluation to that is twofold. One, actually the firm might become so big that in reality they start experiencing not economies of scale but diseconomies of scale. And also the managerial conflicts that could arise, especially like we call cultural conflicts that could arise within a country, so within a firm, could result in a demerger in the long run. So therefore, it may not necessarily be sustained. The merger, they might break down, basically, yeah? That's the micro aspect of it. Right, the macro factors that influence how a business might grow. One of the things that I think you could potentially talk about here is whether it is easy on a macro level for that firm to grow. Do you know what I would do here? I would literally talk about interest rates. I would say one macroeconomic factor that will influence growth of a business is the interest rate in that country. Then I would take you through and say, okay, if interest rates in that country are low, is it cheap or expensive for firms to borrow money? Obviously low. So if the central bank cut the base rate, basically you go like that. If the central bank were to cut the base rate, then firms will be able to borrow at these lower interest rates. The cost of borrowing is lower. This translates into higher levels of investment. This in turn makes them more globally competitive. This enables them to basically sell more in the global market, both in terms of, because of their exports, but also domestically as well, right? And they're going to be big, basically. Yeah, that's the analysis. Is that clear? The evaluation to that is, I think, really clever. I think it's dependent on the country though, yeah? If this was asked in the context of the UK economy or the EU or America, any of those three, a brilliant evaluation here is to talk about how, in reality, the base rate cannot really be cut that much more because the base rate in the UK at the moment is 1%, yeah? It's about the same in America and it's about the same in the EU, they're very similar, right? However, the base rate in the UK and all these countries has been really close to zero for the best part of a decade. Therefore, they are likely to suffer from something called a liquidity trap. A liquidity trap is a fancy way of saying where monetary policy becomes ineffective as further cuts to the base rate have little to no impact, as commercial banks are unwilling to cut their interest rates any lower. Commercial banks might be at the point where they go, you know what, I don't want to cut my interest rate any lower than they're already gone because it's just my risk tolerance. Like I'm not willing to go below that level, right? Therefore, monetary policy may not be enough to stimulate growth of that particular sector or that particular firm in that country, especially right now. Is that clear? I hope that's okay. Yeah. All right. A few other questions. Some of you are asking questions. How can you explain how business growth is affected by interest? Yeah, it's basically saying that if interest rates are low, it enables firms to borrow more cheaply, and the consequences of them borrowing more cheaply is that they can invest, and then that helps them to grow. Yeah, high levels of investment means that they're more technologically advanced. They're going to be higher demand. Could you speak about corporation tax? Yeah, of course. By the way, bear in mind, right, when you do this and practice, the mark scheme is so full of points, and it's not limited to the mark scheme as well. Your theoretical knowledge is so high now that you can draw in multitude of different factors. The one you choose, and this is why I would advise that you plan your essays, the 25 markers before you start them, is the 2 points, micro and macro, that you feel the most comfortable developing in the most detail. Yeah, the ones where you have real depth to your chains of reasoning are the ones that I want you to do. Hence why when I was doing the supply side policy essay, I would have definitely done education training for the macro, because I know how to analyze it comfortably and the evaluation. And I definitely would have done subsidies for micro because I know how to analyze it and again, evaluate it comfortably. Yeah, is that clear? Low cost means high. Yeah, so low cost means that they're going to invest more. Yeah, there's no such thing as marginal propensity to invest as far as I'm aware, but just say, yeah, they're going to invest more. Yeah, is that clear? Cool, right, next question on our list. I want to go through exchange rates. I want to make sure that you guys absolutely know how to answer exchange rates. And the reason why is because exchange rates can come up as a 5, an 8, a 12, or a 25. It will obviously come up because they've mentioned it on their advanced notice. And I want to build up. I want to start with it being a 5, and then an 8, and then a 12, and then we'll do a 25, pretty much in simultaneous, like in one sequence. So the first thing in terms of 5 markers is why a currency might appreciate or depreciate. Yeah. So floating exchange rates are determined through supply and demand. There's no government intervention. It is left to free market forces to determine. I always want you to draw a supply and demand diagram when you are explaining why a currency has depreciated or appreciated, or devalued or revalued. Devalued means that the central bank intervened, or revalued, again, they intervened to make it stronger. Yeah, okay, so let's say hypothetically we have the following. So let's say the context was price of lira, so this is the Turkish currency, in, let's say, dollars, yeah, over here, and this is the quantity of lira. We have the following: supply, demand. Okay. You guys need to practice, and it's part of my guidance that I have provided to you. I've put together a lot of past paper questions that you should practice on to be really comfortable with this. But let me go through like 2 factors that are going to influence supply and demand of the exchange rate to cause it to appreciate or depreciate. Never ever try to figure out whether it appreciates or depreciates immediately. Make sure you understand what is shifting and why it's shifting. Then you can see whether it's appreciated or depreciated. So imagine it says in the extract that Turkey's inflation rate is really high. Yeah. So let's say they have, and it's true, they have very high levels of inflation in Turkey right now. What would that mean? Well, the logic is as follows. You go, all right, if there's high levels of inflation in Turkey, the demand for Turkish goods are likely to fall. They're less globally competitive. If the demand for Turkish goods decreases, do you agree that that means the demand for the lira decreases? Because if I am not buying as many Turkish products, I'm not going to buy as many lira. So demand shifts to the left, causing the currency, now you can clearly see, to depreciate. Is that fair? That is the first example that I wanted to go through. So if there's inflation in an economy, that translates into less demand for their goods, and therefore less demand for their currency, demand in depreciation. Scenario number 2. Let's say now it says that the interest rate in Turkey is really, really low because I don't know, for whatever reason, yeah, or the interest rate in a particular country is really, really low. Right, let's figure it out. When it comes to interest rates and the exchange rate, there is a very important link that you need to draw, which is hot money. Hot money is investors on a global basis are looking to park their money, put their money in bank accounts that will give them the highest rate of return. In other words, the highest interest on your money. So hot money can either flow into an economy or it can flow out of an economy. Well, in this context, if interest rates are really low, are people going to park their money in Turkey or take it out of Turkey and put it somewhere else? Well, obviously, they're going to basically take their money and move it out to, like, I don't know, Switzerland and Norway and wherever it is that they're putting it in, right? How do they do that? If I have money in the Turkish economy and I now want to basically move it into the USA, I need to sell my lira and buy US dollars. We often on day-to-day basis, by the way, talk about it as like we convert it. Yeah, we do, but that's confusing. You need to sell to buy. You can't just buy something in this context, in the foreign exchange market anyway. So you go, all right, there's going to be more people that are selling the Turkish lira now to buy more dollars. So therefore supply shifts outwards. And again, the currency is going to depreciate. Is that clear? So that's the second context. Right, I'll do one more just to hopefully make it really clear, because this could be a 5 or it could be an 8. The last one is this. I'll do 2 more actually, sorry, really quickly. The next one I could talk about is higher levels of growth in that economy. So let's say the extract is about, there's high levels of growth in Turkey. How might that impact the exchange rate? The reason why it impact the exchange rate is because when people's incomes rise, now if, let's say actually from the UK very quickly, if in the UK my income were to go up, I would consume more goods and services. But when I consume more goods and services domestically in the UK, does that have any direct impact on the exchange rates? No, right? This is literally the foreign exchange market where people are buying and actively selling currency. So when you go to like an exchange booth, that's you partaking in the foreign exchange market. You going to a corner shop and buying a Snickers bar has absolutely zero influence whatsoever on the exchange market, the foreign exchange market. Yeah, that's really important to understand. But how then is my higher income going to influence this? The reason why is because, yes, I will demand more domestically, but I will also demand more from abroad. I will buy more imported goods. But how do I import more goods and services? I need to buy it in their currency, which means I need to sell my currency and buy the foreign currency. In other words, here, if I was in Turkey, let's say, and my income went up, I would sell lira and I would buy euros, dollars, pounds, whatever. Again, supply would shift outwards, causing the currency again to depreciate. Is that clear? The very, very final one, so that I cover like a nice list of different ones, is What about if your main trading partner is going through a recession? How does that impact your currency? Yeah. If there is a downturn in your main trading partner, do you agree that that means the incomes in those countries are going down? Do you agree that that translates into them not being able to afford as much as your goods, or not wanting as much? That's probably a better way to describe it. They'll demand less of your goods. If they demand less of my goods, they'll demand less of my currency. Demand shifts in. Again, by coincidence, it did depreciate it again. Is that clear? So that's literally the various factors to look for in the extract. It is often explicitly stated. When you do your point and you're explaining it, please draw supply and demand. I would highly advise, because I think that extract was a bit more subtle, June 2016, Unit 4, question 4, I think it's a 10 marker. I think it's 4C. It might be 40, I'm pretty sure it's 4C, yeah, on Ghana. Not only to do that question, but then to dig up the examiner report. If you're not sure how to dig it up, email me, I'll send you a link. But the examiner report is amazing for Edexcel in particular, right? It basically gives you real students' answers. There's an answer in there that gets 10 out of 10, and it is phenomenal. And do you know why it's phenomenal? It's not because of the fact that it's sophisticated. That's what makes it phenomenal. It's so simple. It is so to the point and so straightforward. Please read that answer. It is excellent. Okay, really quickly before I move on to the next part of exchange rates, would hot money flow shift supply or demand? Hot money flows would be dependent, right? So if interest rates are high in your economy and hot money is flowing in, demand would shift outwards. If hot money is flowing out, then people are selling the currency, supply will be shifting outwards. Yeah. The paper I said, by the way, it's the Ghana question, June 2016, Unit 4, old spec. You can find it on our website. Unit 4, and the extract is about Ghana. And there's a 10 marker about why the Ghanaian currency, the CD, has depreciated. Yeah, it is exceptional, that answer. All right, cool. With this in mind, let's now jump all the way to a 25 marker. So this is the kind of thing that you're likely to see as a potential 8 or a 5. It could be a 12 if we're quite lucky, but 25 marker would say something like this. And if this comes up, you need to do this question because you'll get 25 out of 25. It will be so easy. Question says the following: evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of a depreciation of the, let's say, kwacha. Yeah, the kwacha is the Zambian currency. Yeah, so let's say evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of a depreciation of the kwacha. 25 marks. Let's do it. Right. I would, if I were you, start this with macro, yeah? Because obviously this is a macro concept and it should be pretty easy to develop the macro concept, and then we'll deal with the micro in a second. If a currency depreciates, there's like what I call a trigger, whereby if you just get that first kind of trigger, you will immediately know the chains of reasoning and develop them in detail. The trigger is as follows. You go, if the currency has depreciated, are you more or less internationally price competitive? Well, the answer is that you are more internationally price competitive because you're cheaper. Your currency is weaker in the global market, which means other currencies can buy more of it. When it comes to the current account, by the way, think of Germany and China as your main examples. They both sell or export more than they import, but for two very different reasons. People buy Chinese goods. Why? Because Chinese goods are cheap. Therefore, they are price competitive. People buy German goods not because they're cheap, but because they're high quality. Therefore, they are quality competitive, right? So I'd start off by saying, oh, the kwacha depreciating makes the Zambian economy more internationally price competitive. Exports therefore go up. Exports up. Now, those of you that have come to these Q&As before, you'll know that I will drill into you for the 25 marker the importance of one basic question. It is the second last letter in the English alphabet, and you need to ask yourself it multiple times in your exam in the 25 marker and 12 marker, particularly 25 marker, to get depth. And that question is why? Why? If I say exports have gone up, yeah, okay, they have. Why though? Well, the answer is because international currencies such as the dollar can now buy more kwacha. At the same time, imports are likely to what? Fall. And again, you should in your mind in the exam go, why? Why does that happen? The why there is because of the fact that the kwacha now buys less in the global market. So we've got exports going up, imports going down. What does that do to their current account deficits? If it says that they're in a surplus, by the way, you can say, what does it do to their surplus? Yeah. Well, if you're not sure, if maths isn't your thing, should I tell you the easiest way to figure this out? You go, okay, imagine, make up numbers, just get a scrap piece of paper in the exam, or do it on the side. And you go, imagine that exports are 100 and imports are equal to, let's say, 150, yeah, so that they're in deficit. Well, X minus M initially is minus 50. Do we agree? Yeah. Now, underneath it, go, all right, well, I just figured out, based on my analysis above, that exports are going to go up. Okay, just literally do any number bigger than 100, to 120, yeah? And imports are going to go down. Give me a number smaller than 150, let's say 140, yeah? X minus M, therefore, has become minus 20, yeah? What happened to my deficit? My deficit shrank, yeah? If you can do that in your head, amazing, that will save you time. If you're not certain, this is what you could do, yeah? So you basically go, okay, this results in a reduction in Zambia's current account deficit. Is that clear? Now, because it's 25 marker, that actually is enough. That is really good, and it's not bad, but I want a bit more depth for the 25 marker. What I now do is as follows. I go, also, X minus M is a component of AD. Therefore, AD is going to shift outwards. Exports are also a injection. Thank you. I don't know if you're saying it, but I'm pretending that you are. Injection into the circular flow of income. And so there will be a positive multiplier effect. You draw the diagram, you show off with AD shifting out 2 times. First time because X minus M got better. Second time because of the positive multiplier effect. You draw, summarize, and the examiner at that point is probably standing up giving you like applauding you. It's amazing. That's your first analysis. Evaluation. I need this to properly make sense, because the probability is if it's a 12 or a 25 on Monday, you need to talk about this. You need to evaluate with this concept. Every single time the question is about a depreciation, an appreciation, a revaluation, or a devaluation, I don't care, and you have linked it to the current account, which you should, your evaluation is to say the following. However, for there to be, in this case, an improvement on the UK's current account following a depreciation of the pound, kwacha, yeah? The Marshall-Lerner condition must be satisfied, right? It is obligatory to do this, yeah? So you go, the Marshall, let's say spell it, Lerner condition must be satisfied. If I were you, I would memorize this for Monday. And this is what you now say the condition is. This states that the average sum of the price elasticities of imports and exports must be greater than 1. And you should know from theme 1 what that means, in brackets, right? Elastic. In other words, your exports and imports collectively need to be elastic. Otherwise, whatever you just said in the analysis is nonsense. So again, so it says, however, for there to be an improvement on Zambia's current account, following the depreciation of the kwacha, the Marshall-Lerner condition must be satisfied. Full stop. This states that the average sum of the price elasticities of imports and exports must be greater than 1, in brackets, elastic. By the way, bear in mind, this recording will go straight away onto YouTube, yeah? So you guys can watch it back in your own time and a million times if you want to, yeah? Right, you ready? I need this to actually make sense, because it's one of those theories where it will really help you to understand it. I will do it through a basic explanation, and then I will do a more mathsy explanation, which hopefully sheds a bit more light as well. But ultimately, let's break it down between exports and imports. So prior to this, by the way, our analysis that we just did, and this is the analysis you would have consistently done in theme 2, is really childish, whereby we go, oh, look, our currency is cheaper. Yeah, it's depreciated. Exports are going to go up. So that's in terms of quantity, right? We're going to sell more exports, and imports are going to go down. Yes, current account's getting better. That's rubbish. The reason why that's nonsense is because that is purely quantity. I also need to know how much I'm selling my goods for and how much I'm paying for my imports, right? It ignores the monetary value of exports and the monetary value of imports. And you can break this down into 2 parts, starting with exports, right? If you and I sell, let's say we sell in our shop, I don't know, let's sell cans of Red Bull. They need to pay me for this advert. But if we sell cans of Red Bull, and I'm like to you guys, all right, we have decided to reduce the price of our Red Bull cans. What will happen to the demand? Obviously, demand is going to go up, right? Do we agree with that? If I reduce the price, demand is going to go up. Is that sufficient information, though, to determine whether we make more or less revenue? Well, the answer is no, obviously not, because what if I then told you, oh, by the way, we reduced the price of the Red Bull can by 50%, and we got 1% extra demand, right? Obviously, we're worse off because everything that we're selling is half the price it was before, and yet demand only slightly went up. We're not better off, we're worse off. The same thing is true when it comes to the exports out of your economy when there's a depreciation. When there's a depreciation or a devaluation, everything you're selling globally is now cheaper. Therefore, of course, you'll sell more, obviously. But how much more you sell will determine whether you make more money or less money. The same thing, by the way, in terms of imports. Now, imports are more expensive, right? So, of course, I can't import as much. I'll import less. But if I only import a tiny bit less, in other words, if it's inelastic, am I paying more than I was before or less than I was before? Well, I'm paying way more than I was before because I've paid more for every unit, but only reduced my demand a little bit. Is my current account getting better? No, my current account is getting worse. That's the kind of theoretical explanation, which I hope is clear enough. Let's do the maths. And I hope the maths is really, really clear. Yeah. So let's just go through it with a made up example. So let's say hypothetically that the elasticity, the PED of your exports is equal to minus 0. Let's say 7. Yeah. And your imports elasticity, I don't know where my thing has gone. Where'd it go? Technology failed me for a second. Hello, exports. Okay, we'll do a new page. Sorry. So let's say the X is equal to minus 0.7. Yeah, I can see that, right? And M is equal to, let's say, minus 2.0. Yeah? Okay, let's look at it like this. First and foremost, is the Marshall Lerner condition satisfied in this made-up example over here? Well, the way you can figure it out is you add these two numbers together, ignore the minuses. When we deal with elasticities, we're doing it as a raw number, like a without the minuses. So 2.7 divided by 2, is that bigger than 1? Yeah, it's bigger than 1. So is it satisfied? It is satisfied. Let's understand then mathematically what would happen in this made-up example. So let's do it with pounds. I know my question was about kwacha, but imagine I said to you guys that initially the value of a pound is just £1, yeah? And we were selling to the global market 100 units to start off with. I chose 100 to make our life easier. How much export revenue were we initially making? Well, very simple maths. If you're getting it, we give yourself a big pat on the back. Is £100. Wow. £1 multiplied by 100. Easy peasy. Okay. Now, when the currency depreciates, let's say hypothetically the pound depreciates by 10%, yeah? That means everything that we're selling in the global market is 10% cheaper. So in other words, it's the equivalent now of 90p. Right. This is where this number will come into effect now, the minus 0.7. Because remember, percentage change in quantity demanded, in this case of exports, over the percentage change in the price, in this case is basically the exchange rate, is equal to, and in this case, minus 0.7. Well, I've just said to you that the currency has depreciated by 10%. So that's minus 10. And that's minus 0.7, right? So if I want to know the demand, the increase in demand for, because exports are going to go up, right? I simply need to multiply minus 10 by minus 0.7. Really basic maths results in a 7% increase in demand. And if you notice, by the way, that's less than proportionate because it's minus 0.7, less than 1. In words or in numbers, if my initial demand was 100 units and there's a 7% increase in demand for my exports, how many units am I exporting now? Did 100 for a reason to make our life nice and easy? It is 107. All right, let's plug it in. My maths isn't good enough to do this without my calculator, so let's do it. So we have 0.9 times 107, which is equal to £96 and 30 pence. Right, this is on the export side. Do you notice, by the way, on the export side of things, I'm worse off. I used to make £100. I now make £96.30 because its exports were inelastic. Let's now deal with it in terms of imports. Well, again, let's do the same thing. So let's say initially my currency was worth £1 in the global market and I was importing 100 units. So how much was I spending on my imports? Well, I was spending £100. Yeah. Now, when the currency depreciates by 10%, that is the equivalent of everything that I'm buying from the world market becoming 10% more expensive. In other words, now my imports are going to cost £1 10 pence. Yeah. So the second thing that I can do is I go, okay, well, the elasticity of imports is minus 2, right? Multiply that number by 10, by minus 10. What'd you get? Well, you're going to get an increase in demand for imports. Sorry, that shouldn't be minus, by the way, so that should just be positive. So what's going to happen is that the demand for your imports are going to go down by 10 times 2, hopefully very easy, it's 20%. 20% reduction in the number of units that I buy. I used to buy 100 imported goods. How many do I buy now? I now buy 80. And if I plug that into my calculator, I should really be able to do this in my head, but let's not embarrass myself with my mental maths. I get £88, obviously. Sorry, it's so obvious. Yeah, £88. This is imports. Now let's compare. Because the Marshall Lerner condition was satisfied, that would have said that the current account, when the currency depreciates, would improve. Did it improve? Initially, my exports, I made £100 on them. My imports were £100 as well. So my X minus M initially was just 0. Now what? On the export side of things, I make less money now, £96.30. However, my imports have dramatically fallen. Therefore, I only pay £88 for my imports. I am now in a surplus. Did my current account get better? Yes, my current account absolutely got better. And to prove the Marshall learning condition, just one last time, and I'm laboring this point, but it's really important, is imagine now instead this number got changed. Yeah. So rather than it being +2, let's say now it was +1, 1.0. Yeah. So now is the Marshall learning condition satisfied? Well, no, because if I do 1 plus 0.7 and divide that by 2, do you agree that that's going to be less than 1? It's inelastic as a collective. Well, let's see what happens. When my currency depreciates by 10%, meaning that my imports are 10% more expensive, this time, when I multiply 10 by 1.0, that means my demand for imports goes down, but only by 10% this time. So it goes down to 90. Look at what happens now. Hopefully my maths isn't really embarrassing. I think that's £99. Yeah, is that right? In which case, is my current account getting better or is it getting worse? Well, you notice initially it was 0. Now it's 96.3 minus 99. I am now in a deficit. My current account got worse. Is that super duper clear? Yeah. So this is our macro point. I'm going to do the micro point in a second. Yeah. So this is the first analysis, and then evaluation is to go, oh, however, it depends on the Marshall learning condition. What you then say after you say the Marshall learning condition is you go, this is because every unit exported out of Zambia is now cheaper, whilst every unit imported is now more expensive. And I now want you to add, on the mark scheme, by the way, this is often regarded as a second evaluation. Don't care. We're going to do them together. They're going to come as a pair, is when I'm going to draw the J-curve. The J-curve looks like this, and I need to explain it. So let's go through it. So time, current account, and this is positive, this is negative. Okay. Where I start, by the way, on the J-curve depends on whether the country itself is in a surplus or a deficit. So if it was like the UK, I'd be somewhere down there. If it was like Germany or China, I would start somewhere up there. Fine. So let's assume that Zambia has a current account deficit. I actually don't know, but it will be pretty. They're not going to penalize you, brother, if you put it into the wrong quadrant. It's not a big deal. You start off by basically saying, imagine nothing has happened yet. So over here, yeah, just where nothing has happened, no exchange rate change has happened. The way to figure out the shape of this curve, we call it the J curve, but it can be inverse, by the way, is to go, okay, whatever I have said in the analysis, the opposite happens first. So in the analysis, what did we say happens to the current account deficit? Well, in the analysis, we said the current account deficit got better. It was less negative. Well, that means when I draw this, I go, nah, in the short run, it's going to get worse. It's going to do the opposite. So it goes down, and then eventually it goes up. And I will need you to understand why. So let's go through that point in time, by the way, that exact moment where all of this happens here is the moment that the kwacha depreciated. So this is depreciation of the kwacha. Yeah, I might be saying it really wrong, but I hope I'm saying it right. Anyways, let's understand why. In the short run, that means the exports and imports are pretty inelastic. The Marshall learning condition is not satisfied. How comes? What are firms in Zambia likely to be tied into? Well, the answer is contracts. They are likely to be tied into trade contracts that they cannot immediately get out of. Therefore, although you might want to export a lot more because you're cheaper, and although you might want to import a lot less, you cannot. You can't call up the firm in another country and go, hey, by the way, my currency just depreciated. You're going to need to buy loads more of me, and I'm going to buy next to nothing off you, mate. They're like, no, we have a contract. Therefore, is the Marshall learning condition satisfied? Absolutely not. Most likely not. Therefore, that's why the current account gets worse first. Then eventually, in the long run, we assume the contracts can be renegotiated, and they'll factor in the fact that the currency is weak now. And thus, if the Marshall learning condition is satisfied, the current account will now get better. This is ridiculously high evaluation. Yeah, you are to do Marshall Learner and you are to combine it with the J curve. That is the first half of this essay. Second half of the essay is micro time. When it comes to micro, remember what I said. I said, bring it back to cost and revenue, link it to the firm, make it about the firm. Well, if the currency has depreciated, do you agree that that makes the firm more competitive in the global market? Do you agree that that translates into higher demand for their goods and services? Do we know how to draw a cost and revenue diagram with demand increasing? Obviously, we know how to draw a cost and revenue diagram with demand increasing. Let's go through it. So we have this cost / revenue. We're going to do this MC. Right, because I'm about to shift demand, you notice that I did not put the AR curve too high up on the y-axis. I started a little bit lower to give myself a bit of breathing space. So here we are. So we have this, yeah? Q1, P1, and sorry, it's not the nicest diagram in the world, but it will do. C1, and again, letters, yeah? So A, B. Okay. When there's an increase in demand because your goods are now globally more competitive and therefore more attractive in the global market, AR and MR will shift outwards. Demand shifts out. Again, I could have drawn supply and demand, but our IQ exceeds 10. We're adults. Yeah, well, most of you will be adults at this stage, and you are more than capable. Therefore, you're going to draw it from a cost and revenue diagram perspective to get an A star, because that's what we're here for. So the way I want you to do that is you're going to just simply start at a higher point on the y-axis and shift it parallel. Yeah. So I would do something like this. So it would be like AR2 equals D2, and this will be MR2. Yeah. Profit maximizing level of output is where MC equals MR, while the new MC equals MR intersection point is over here, Q2. I then go up until I hit the new demand curve there, P2. And then I hit the AC curve over here, C2. Now, we'll talk about my diagram in a moment. D, E. Yeah? Okay, there are so many things to talk about here. Once you've drawn that, now you basically say, the outward shift of demand caused by increased sales to the global market results in a rise in the price the firm can charge from P1 to P2. Their sales rise from Q1 to Q2. Now, on my diagram, and I did it on purpose, and often if you do yours, as long as your AC curve isn't too flat, yeah, can you see that my cost went down? Now, it didn't have to go down, but it did go down here. Why did it go down? And that actually is amazing because it gives me a whole other channel of chain of reasoning that I could develop now. The reason why my costs for my firm went down is because they tapped into greater economies of scale. Those of you that got it, very well done. Yeah, they now are able to tap into more, for example, purchasing economies of scale because of the fact that they're producing more output. They've got a bigger market share. They can bulk buy more of whatever it is that they need to bulk buy because they cater to a larger market now. Does that make sense? So you can also, the cost for the firm fell from C1 to C2 as the firm was able to tap into greater economies of scale. Then you go, this translates into a higher level of profit from P1 AB C1 to P2 DE C2. Now I can easily just do the following to wrap it up. If you're running out of time, by the way, that's enough, right? But if you have time, you go, okay, what can they do with the profits? Well, these additional profits can be invested into like the latest technology, into research and development, to improve the quality of the good, and therefore the firm becomes more dynamically efficient. That paragraph is now gorgeous. Is that clear? Yeah? That is the point. Is that all clear? Right, the evaluation to that. Now, if you had time, you'd also draw the diagram, but this is so clever, I think, personally. I mean, I'm very biased. I'm making up these points, obviously I say this, but so we just talked about how the profitability of the firm would go up because the exchange rate depreciated. Yeah? Why might it go down? Anyone know? Why might actually their profitability go down, not go up? Right. Can I explain? The rationale is that we assume, and rightly so, that firms import a certain amount of their raw materials. Any country, realistically, will import a certain percentage of its raw materials. Well, if the kwacha has depreciated, is it cheaper or more expensive to import from the rest of the world? Do you agree that it is more expensive? Is that clear, right? It's more expensive for you to import from the rest of the world because you have to convert more kwacha to buy €1, to buy $1, to buy whatever, yeah? The consequences of that then is if it's more expensive for you to import your raw materials, are raw materials a fixed or variable cost? The answer is that they're a variable cost because you get to decide how many units you buy. And each unit that you're importing is now more expensive. What do you draw? You can now draw MC and AC going up because suddenly now the cost per unit rises. And rather than the firm now on the diagram making more profit, they'll make less profit. Rather than the quantity they sell increasing, it will decrease, right? You draw the diagram. I can't bother to be honest. I've got loads of other questions. I'm going to cover it in the next 20 minutes. You draw the diagram and explain that actually costs may actually translate. Sorry, the profitability might go down, not up, because of the exchange rate going down. And you could go one step further if you had the time and you go, oh, actually the firms even might shut down. Yeah, especially if a large proportion of their costs are accounted for by imports. That's a problem. Yeah. It's almost like dependent on whether the demand increases more or their cost goes up more. That will determine whether they make more profit, less profit, etc. Is that clear? And that, by the way, is your 25. Obviously, do a judgment, and then you're hopefully happy. Right, let me have a look. How long should we spend on the 25 marker with the higher time pressure? Okay, it's a really good question. So excluding any extra time that you might have in an exam, the total marks in this exam, like the previous papers, are 100 marks. However, it's harder to finish it in that time because of the fact that you don't have the luxury of section A with some nice little multiple choice questions, which wouldn't have taken a minute. 4 markers. You guys got some dream 4 markers, by the way, like seriously, like multiplier for 4 marks. Are you joking? Like that would not have taken 4 minutes. Yeah. You're not going to really have that. I'm hoping that on the back of this session, at least 1 or 2 questions, and if you practice using my guidance as well, at least a handful of questions will come up that you will be really ready for and know how to answer very, very quickly. Yeah. If you're running out of time, before I answer how long you should spend for the 25 marker, if you're running out of time, unless the question explicitly says reasons or factors with an S, yeah, the 12 marker, 1 well-developed analysis and 1 well-developed evaluation will get you 12 marks. So if you find yourself in the second data response, running a little bit short on time, please do 1 and 1 rather than 2 and 2. Is that clear? So that is the best advice I can give. Now, in terms of minute per mark, if you work on a minute per mark basis, and there's quite a lot to read, by the way, in terms of data. If I were you, by the way, those of you at Edexcel, take 2 color highlighters into the exam. I don't know, like green and yellow, for example. Yeah. And what I would want you to do is you would have a highlighter specifically for the 12 marker and a highlighter specifically for 20. You choose your 25 marker, by the way, before you read the data. You'll know from reading it which question you feel more comfortable doing. You'll know what topic it is. It'll be very obvious. Yeah. Choose it. And then whenever you find anything in the data, because the data will be so helpful, I promise. Yeah. Make sure you highlight it in that color so that you're drawn to it later on. Because by the time you've done the 5 and the 8, maybe and the 12, you might have forgotten some of the concepts or the points in the 25 marker that you want to apply. Your eye is drawn to that color. Yeah. So go a minute a mark. And if you do it a minute a mark, that gives you in total, so there's 100 marks, 20 minutes left. Let's say 10 minutes reading section, the first section, 10 minutes reading this other section, and then you are hopefully okay. But look, my advice is really this. Plan the questions that are like 25 markers and 12 markers. Plan them really quickly if you need to plan it. But then when it comes to writing, write like your life depends on it. Yeah, write as fast as you can write. Cool. Hopefully that answers the questions. Do you refer to micro and macro in data response questions? No. So the question was, do you talk about micro and macro? No. In the 5, 8, 12, don't do that. Just answer the question. Yeah. Whereas in the 25 marker, you have to split it. You have to do micro and you have to do macro. Is that hopefully clear in terms of some of the questions that I just got? All right, cool. Let's go through another 25 marker. Are you guys ready? So the question that I want us to do, let me have a look, is evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of demand side policies adopted during the pandemic. Ready? So it says, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of demand side policies that were adopted during the pandemic. Okay, so we're doing this from the perspective of the UK, yeah? And what interventions were done in terms of monetary policy and in terms of fiscal policy. Okay. Again, by the way, on a macro level, this should be really straightforward. This is like dreamland in macro land. But in micro terms, you might be like, how do I link this to micro? Let me show you how you link it to micro. The way you link it to micro is I would do monetary policy for micro. And the reason why I would do monetary policy for micro is because I would go, okay, the Bank of England during the pandemic cut the base rate to a record low of 0.1%. What does that mean? What that means is the cost of borrowing for firms should have fallen. And as a consequence of that, their costs of borrowing decrease. As a result, their variable cost, you could argue, goes down because every loan now they take out is going to be cheaper compared to what it would have been before. Again, MC, AC, shift them down, draw it, profitability, happy days. There are 2 valuations. Is that clear, by the way? Yeah. So first analysis in terms of micro is to go one microeconomic effect of the government or the central bank reducing interest rates is higher profitability. If you notice, by the way, that's a very common topic sentence I do for the micro points. So it's that the monetary policy enacted by the central bank may have resulted in higher profits for the firms. Why? You very briefly explain now. It's unavoidable to go macro and micro sometimes in the same paragraph. So you go the Bank of England cut the base rate, as the extract probably will state, to a record low of 0.1% to combat the ill effects of the pandemic, pun intended, right? And then you basically develop it by talking about how, oh, if they basically cut it, cost of production for the firms are going to go down. They can borrow more money. They could invest more. Now, you could either go down the route of saying, oh, their costs are going to go down because of the fact that they're borrowing money more cheaply from banks. Or you could say that if they invested that money, their quality rises and therefore demand shifts out. And you can do AR and MR shift. I don't mind. Both of them are fine as long as you're drawing a cost and revenue diagram and then commenting on the cost and revenue diagram in terms of profitability. I am happy. Yes, that is the analysis. Yeah, you could talk about that and why that will benefit firms. 2 evaluations. And you notice how repetitive this becomes. 1, the first, yes, AC and MC fall, by the way. I would make the argument that it's a variable cost because when you take out loans now from the bank, every single unit, every loan you're taking out is a lower cost. Yeah. You could have just done it as AC falling, by the way, on like your existing loans if they were variable loans. But don't worry about that. Yeah. Evaluation. 1. Is realistically, did the commercial banks cut their interest rates by any significant amount when the Bank of England cut their base rate? No, because they're likely to be suffering from a liquidity trap. The base rate in the UK economy, by the way, has been below or at 1%. So it's actually at the highest level right now, 1%. Since 2009, March 2009, the Bank of England cut the base rate to 0.5%. Yeah. The consequences of that means that actually it's already near 0%, and it has been for so long. Realistically, are the commercial banks willing to cut their interest rates any lower than they already had done? Not really. Therefore, the monetary policy that happened in the financial crash, you could argue was kind of just a kind of empty gesture. Would it have resulted in any substantial increase in or the amount of loans or a substantial increase in lending? No, not really, because of the fact that the banks realistically would have had their interest rates already so low. Is that clear? That's the first thing. The second is that even though their cost of borrowing money might have gone down, another evaluation, this is an entirely different evaluation, is that during the pandemic, the demand may have shifted in dramatically. And so although their costs may fall, that might be offset by a massive decrease in the demand for their goods and services, especially if they're like an airline, because COVID obviously would have impacted that industry pretty badly. Therefore, rather than profits rising, profits may be falling. And even potentially some of these firms might shut down. Even the lower cost of borrowing that money may not be enough to kind of withstand the tide of the fall in demand for that company's goods and services. Is that clear? Someone asked, can you double shift AC, MC, and AR, MR? Okay. If you're Edexcel, don't do that. If you are Educast, they love that stuff. They love it. Yeah. In which case, yes, you can. Edexcel, don't do that. There's just absolutely no point. Yeah. So don't do that. Okay. Just do one of the 2. Okay. So that's micro. Is that clear? That's my micro side. And now that I've done micro, we're laughing. Like it's just the easiest thing in the world now. Now I do macro. And the macro side is, what did the government enact? The demand side policy there was very expansionary fiscal policy. So a macroeconomic effect of fiscal policy during the pandemic is to stimulate growth or to prevent unemployment rising, something like that, right? The government spent loads of money, especially on the furlough scheme, whereby they were essentially paying for salaries up to 80%. They also spent loads of money on things like test and trace, and also on things like the vaccine rollout program. Anyways, in a nutshell, we go government spending. There's a component of AD. AD, therefore, is going to shift outwards. Government spending is also, hopefully you guys now know, shouting at your screen, you go, government spending is an injection into the circular flow of income. And so there will be a positive multiplier effect. Economic growth goes, and you draw the diagram, obviously, economic growth goes up, unemployment goes down. And you can, again, use the extract thoroughly, please, to flesh these out in more detail. The extract will be very, very helpful. Yeah. Evaluation, you should all now hopefully know what my evaluation is going to be. The UK's fiscal deficit rose. The UK national debt is nearly 100% of GDP now. That is really high. As a consequence, what might happen? It might result in a downgrade in the UK's credit rating. If there's a downgrade in the UK's credit rating, that would translate into less demand for UK government bonds. As such, this would result in lower prices per UK government bond. UK bonds, by the way, if you want to know, called gilts. Yeah. And thus the yield, the interest rate that's paid out on the government bond goes up. This increases the cost of borrowing for the UK government and thus makes it more difficult for them to service future debts. 25 out of 25 easily. Do you see how I made the micro point about monetary policy? That's an easy one to do. Yeah. Is that clear? Those are the kind of things that I would do for that type of question. Right, let's try and squeeze in one more question before we wrap it up. Right. Evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of, okay, like interventionist strategies to promote economic development. Okay, let's broaden it out a little bit. In your notes and in your revision, you should know the differences between. Can you go through a very, very quick judgment? Yeah, okay, fine. In terms of how I would make a judgment for this, is I would say something along the lines of the demand side policies that were enacted during COVID are likely to have had positive impacts on both a micro and macro level in supporting businesses and ensuring that they did not go bust. For example, the Help Out to Eat Out scheme, what that was called, I don't remember what it was called, that was enacted by the government may have helped generate high levels of revenue and profit for restaurants that would have been badly hit by the pandemic. Nonetheless, fiscal policy would have been far more effective in achieving these objectives or in helping both businesses and the macroeconomy than monetary policy, as interest rates are already very low. As such, on a micro and macro level, realistically, the only thing that impacted the economy would have been fiscal, something like that. Yeah, I made that up on the spot. You could always think of something a little bit better than that, but something along those lines. Is that clear? Right, going back to economic development and strategies and the microeconomic effects of certain strategies to promote economic growth and development. Okay, let's have a think of the macro. Okay, cool. This is what I would do. Right, ready? So the question is, evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of strategies to promote economic development. Let's do a specific development. 25 marks. Let's do it. So evaluate the microeconomic and macroeconomic effects of strategies to promote economic development. Right. I am going to start with this. You know what? We'll start it, and then I might actually amend the micro into a macro or macro into micro. We'll do that later. Let's just actually go through what I think are really, really good points for this. Of course, by the way, it is again dependent on data. Certain points might be easier to apply and develop and flesh out based on the fact that the data might support you on those points. Okay. But if I were doing this, the first thing I would be talking about is the Lewis model. Yeah. I need you to understand the Lewis model, and the Lewis model I can explain and develop through micro or macro, but let me just explain concept broadly. The Lewis model can be summarized in one word, which is that he says that these countries need to industrialize, that they are far too primary product dependent. Okay. And this is how the theory works. He says, so according to the Lewis model, there is an excess supply of labor in the agricultural sector. In other words, there are far too many workers in the agricultural sector. Now, you can easily find evidence of this in the data. If it says that a certain percentage of GDP is in agriculture, that's an indication. If it says a certain percentage of people work in the agricultural sector, that's a quote. So basically, look how many people work in the agricultural sector. So he argues that there's an excess supply of labor in the agricultural sector. There are too many farmers on the farms. Therefore, the marginal productivity of labor, right? Fancy way of saying, if you were to add an extra farmer to the farm, how much output would that farmer generate? So the marginal productivity of labor, what would it be? Well, the answer is that it would be practically zero. It would be zero or close to zero because they're just getting in each other's way. What is that based on? This is the micro concept that it's built on. It is based on the law of diminishing marginal returns, which you should know about from theme 3, why the MC curve looks the way it does. If you keep adding farmers to this overcrowded farm, eventually they're going to get in each other's way to the point where it could even become negative, right? So the marginal productivity of labor is zero or close to zero because of the law of diminishing marginal returns. As such, he says, if you move the excess labor out of agriculture into manufacturing, what is the opportunity cost? Well, the opportunity cost is nothing. They're not producing anything. They're just literally hanging around. And if you move them into the manufacturing sector, you gain two key benefits. One, the first benefit that you gain is that you diversify your economy so you are less vulnerable to negative shocks in the agricultural sector. When the agricultural sector sees a significant fall in the price of your primary product, you're not as badly affected now because you've got a strong manufacturing sector. Two, a strong manufacturing sector is likely to attract FDI, and you can develop all the benefits of FDI there. Yeah. And by the way, the way I could have made this into a micro point, and very easily you can, is to now talk about the fact that FDI can result in external economies of scale. FDI is going to create jobs in the economy. FDI, they're going to invest into infrastructure. So that was external. The things I said earlier now can be applied here once I've developed the model or explained the theory. And then I appreciate in that context, by the way, actually, no, I can do cost and revenue. I just realized I can draw cost and revenue with AC falling. External economies of scale would be depicted by AC going down. So you could do it. And you could do profitability going up again and way. Right. the evaluation to the Lewis model are just the bad things about FDI. Yeah. So if I was doing this on a micro level, so you know what, let's do it as a micro point. If I was doing this on a micro level, FDI and development of tourism is likely to result in a lot of pollution, loads of pollution. Yeah. The manufacturing sector isn't exactly known for being environmentally friendly, is it? So the manufacturing sector is likely to result in higher levels of carbon emissions, higher external costs. You could talk about the negative externalities that arise. Life expectancy in the country might fall. It might result in a higher strain on the NHS in that country. You draw a negative externality and you are flying. Clear? That is the micro aspect of my essay. The macro aspect of my essay and how I can develop that particular country. I mean, we just kind of spoiled for choice in terms of the points that we could do. Which one would I do? If you're running out of time, should I tell you a really easy one to do? A really easy one to do if you're running out of time is supply side policies, education, training. Improve the human capital in that economy. Because if you improve the human capital in that economy and they become more innovative, it allows them to generate more exports. It allows them to provide a better services sector. So again, it diversifies their economy so they're not as reliant on primary products. And then the evaluation is so easy because A, major time lag, and B, that it's going to increase their fiscal deficit, their national debt, their credit rating might be impacted. So that's really easy, by the way. I probably would do that if I was doing this exam. Other strategies that you could talk about instead of that, so there's microfinance, but I'm not a massive fan of that as a, I mean, it's not bad. What else could I do? You could develop the tourism sector. We did the whole essay about tourism. You could do that again. You could do the benefits of tourism. It can help to plug the foreign exchange gap. It can X, Y, Z. Yeah, there's a million things. I'm trying to think of others that are really, really obvious that I think you should definitely do instead. But these are pretty good. Yeah. Another one, by the way, that you could do as a macro point is protectionism. You can go, oh, they need to protect their infant industries because if they had free trade, what would happen is that TNCs would come in, they would tap into the economies of scale that exist in that particular market, and they would undercut all of the domestic firms and therefore shove them out of the market. They have loads of unemployment. Therefore, the government, in order to promote growth and development, should protect domestic industries and the infant industries in the short run. Yeah. And then the evaluation to that would be you draw the tariff diagram, as hopefully maybe you drew on Monday, and you go, oh, but consumers, oh no, so bad, welfare loss and all that stuff, which you should hopefully know. Yeah. Right, really quickly before I let you go, so I got a question. The paper 3 guidance that you wrote, is it written considering what already came up in paper 1 and paper 2? No, not really. I didn't really, as in, like, obviously I knew what had come up by that point, so I wrote it after the second exam. But look, this exam, in my opinion, the key to like really smashing this is ensuring that the big topics you are really, there aren't that many topics here, by the way. You need to be really comfortable with them. A paper that people found really difficult that I recommend highly that you do is the Mozambique question, which is June 2019, question 2. The part B, by the way, was about why it was made up of small firms, the manufacturing sector. Yeah, that's actually a possible question for you again, because of the fact that one of the topics on there is business growth. So I was trying to piece together how they might ask a question about that. And it could be that. It might be, why are certain industries in these developing economies still tiny? Can I actually really quickly answer that? Sorry, I know we might spill over a little bit beyond 8 o'clock, but very, very quickly. Reasons why firms are likely to remain small in a particular industry. One is that it might be the case that no firm is able to fully tap into the economies of scale that exist in that market, because it might be that there's limited access to finance, right? So it might be the case that they can't take out loans from the banks because there's a savings gap and not enough banks around. So the consequences of that is that they're not in a position to basically bulk buy huge quantities of their raw materials. So everyone has very similar average costs. No one has a real cost advantage compared to anyone else. Hence, all the firms in the market are quite small. Yeah. Good example that I understand this by is if you compare the hairdressing industry to the supermarket industry in the UK. Why are there so many small hairdressers, but only a handful of big supermarkets? Well, it's because the supermarkets, to reach the MES, to get to this point on the AC curve, requires enormous amounts of output, right? Whereas in the hairdressing industry, it's far less. Like there's only so much bulk buying that goes on in the hairdressing industry. You bulk buy what, 20 bottles of shampoo a year? Not really that much, yeah? So no, yeah? So that could be one reason why firms are remaining small in a particular market. Another reason why they might be remaining small is simply because of the fact that the barriers to entry generally are pretty low in the market. So it might be that it's actually an industry that it's just very easy to enter, therefore you're going to have tons of competition. But anyways, have a look at the Mozambique question and look at the answer they provided and the examiner report for it as well. Is the paper sectioned into themes for section A or B or randomized? It's randomized. It will not be like micro on one segment and macro on another. But particular topics or particular questions will be micro or macro. An example might be, so in the June 2017 paper, they had an extract about Chile and one about the UK. The Chile one had an 8-marker on externalities. You have externalities, by the way, in your list, hence why I was thinking potentially Zambia. They could ask about the external cost of copper. Do June 2017, definitely, yeah. But the 12-marker was about primary product dependency, which is not micro, it's macro. Clear? So, yeah. Do you have to quote the extract in the 25-marker? You absolutely should. You really, really, really should, yeah. Make sure your application marks are derived in every question from the extracts. This is why you should take some time to read the extracts. Don't just skim read. Read it, absorb it, plan, 25-marker, really quickly with a couple of bullet points. And then when you start writing, write like someone has a gun to your head and you need to write until your arm is almost like falling off. Go that fast, go as fast as you can, yeah? So think, don't jump into an answer. Think, plan, but now you know what you want to say. Write it fast. Cool? Right, hopefully that was relatively helpful. I will upload the link to the paper 3 guidance for those of you that do not have it under the YouTube on the comments. Thank you very much. I really hope that you guys benefit enormously or that you found this helpful. I hope you guys do really well on Monday. For those of you that finish your exams as well, congratulations. Those of you that are still going, you're nearly there. So hopefully you're just a few exams away from having freedom. If you have any questions, by the way, feel free to email me. I will try my best to respond as quickly as I can. I am going between lessons pretty much all the time, but I will try and respond as much as possible. Please, please, please tell other people. And also, if you can leave a review, that would be nice. Just, thank you very much. And yeah, all the best.